Bullets.
Bullets? What else is going on in the forest? It's on fire. So these men are being instructed to be at the head of the line, run into fire. Carter, wake up, start writing, please. Then sit up and start writing. I want you to sit up.
He said more, but much of it could not be understood. He started rapidly forward, with his head turned toward the men. "Come on!" he was shouting. The men stared with blank and yokel-like eyes at him. He was obliged to halt and retrace his steps. He stood then with his back to the enemy and delivered gigantic curses into the faces of the men. His body vibrated from the weight and force of his imprecations, and he could string oaths with the facility of a maiden who strings beads. The friend of the youth aroused. Lurching suddenly forward and dropping to his knees, he fired an angry shot at the persistent woods. This action awakened the men. They huddled no more like sheep. They seemed suddenly to bethink themselves of their weapons, and at once commenced firing. Belabored by their officers, they began to move forward. The regiment, involved like a cart involved in mud and muddle, started unevenly with many jolts and jerks. The men stopped now every few paces to fire and load, and in this manner moved slowly on from trees to trees. The flaming opposition in their front grew with their advance until it seemed that all forward ways were barred by the thin leaping tongues, and off to the right an ominous demonstration could sometimes be dimly discerned. The smoke lately generated was in confusing clouds that made it difficult for the regiment to proceed with intelligence. As he passed through each curling mass, the youth wondered what would confront him on the farther side. The command went painfully forward until an open space interposed between them and the lurid lines. Here, crouching and cowering behind some trees, the men clung with desperation, as if threatened by a wave. They looked wild-eyed, and as if amazed at this furious disturbance they had stirred. In the storm there was an ironical expression of their importance. The faces of the men, too, showed a lack of a certain feeling of responsibility for being there. It was as if they had been driven. It was the dominant animal, failing to remember in the supreme moments the forceful causes of various superficial qualities. The whole affair seemed incomprehensible to many of them. As they halted thus, the lieutenant again began to bellow profanely. Regardless of the vindictive threats of the bullets, he went about coaxing, berating, and bedamning. His lips, that were habitually in a soft and childlike curve, were now writhed into unholy contortions. He swore by all possible deities. Once he grabbed the youth by the arm. "Come on, you lunkhead!" he roared. "Come on! We'll all get killed if we stay here. We've only got to go across that lot, and then..." The remainder of his idea disappeared in a blue haze of curses. The youth stretched forth his arm. "Cross there?" His mouth was puckered in doubt and awe. "Certainly! Just cross the lot! We can't stay here!" screamed the lieutenant. He poked his face close to the youth and waved his bandaged hand. "Come on!" Presently he grappled with him as if for a wrestling bout. It was as if he planned to drag the youth by the ear onto the assault. The private felt a sudden, unspeakable indignation against his officer. He wrenched fiercely and shook him off. "Come on yourself, then!" he yelled. There was a bitter challenge in his voice. They galloped together down the regimental front. The friend scrambled after them. In front of the colors, the three men began to bawl, "Come on! Come on!" They danced and gyrated like tortured savages. The flag, obedient to these appeals, bended its glittering form and swept toward them. The men wavered in indecision for a moment, and then, with a long, wailful cry, the dilapidated regiment surged forward and began its new journey. Over the field went the scurrying mass. It was a handful of men splattered into the faces of the enemy. Toward it instantly sprang the yellow tongues. A vast quantity of blue smoke hung before them. A mighty banging made ears valueless. The youth ran like a madman to reach the woods before a bullet could discover him. He ducked his head low like a football player. In his haste, his eyes almost closed, and the scene was a wild blur. Pulsating saliva stood at the corners of his mouth. Within him, as he hurled himself forward, was born a love, a despairing fondness for this flag which was near him. It was a creation of beauty and invulnerability. It was a goddess, radiant, that bended its form with an imperious gesture to him. It was a woman, red and white, hating and loving, that called him with the voice of his hopes. Because no harm could come to it, he endowed it with power. He kept near, as if it could be a saver of lives, and an imploring cry went from his mind. In the mad scramble, he was aware that the color sergeant flinched suddenly, as if struck by a bludgeon. He faltered, and then became motionless, save for his quivering knees. He made a spring and a clutch at the pole. At the same instant, his friend grabbed it from the other side. They jerked at it, stout and furious, but the color sergeant was dead, and the corpse would not relinquish its trust. For a moment, there was a grim encounter. The dead man, swinging with bended back, seemed to be obstinately tugging in ludicrous and awful ways for the possession of the flag. It was passed in an instant of time. They wrenched the flag furiously from the dead man, and as they turned again, the corpse swayed forward with bowed head. One arm swung high, and the curved hand fell with heavy protest on the friend's unheeding shoulder.
Okay, finish up there for today. Something pretty big just happened in the battle. Anybody tell me what it was? Henry what? What did he just, no, he didn't run. He was charging. What did he just grab?
The flag.
Flag.
Union flag.
So he's at the very front. Typically the flag bearers at the very front.
Let's explain that word picture real quickly. The way the battle was fought, okay? Some of you will think I'm making this up. I'm not. The way battles were fought in the American Civil War. You ready for this?
They just ran.
First of all, you had two sides. And they came out and they lined up. Okay? Literally. They literally lined up in a line. One side was here. The other side wasn't much further than the wall back there. Okay? And the reason is because the firearms they were shooting are not really that great. These are muzzle-loading firearms. You literally put the little projectile down inside of the rifle barrel, and you have to kind of shove that thing down there, and you got a little gunpowder, okay? One side steps up, they literally aim at the other side, and they shoot. Then those guys have to back up, because they have to reload their firearm, and the next line will step up. Of course, on the other side, they also will shoot. Now, if you know anything about muzzle loaders and gunpowder, you know that as the minute it hits, that flint will hit, lots of smoke comes up. Not from the front of the rifle, but from the back of the rifle, where the smoke comes up. If you multiply that by several hundred guys, when they all shoot at the same time, the smoke immediately can become so you can't see very well. Then the next group steps up and they fire. More smoke. The other side also firing. Smoke. In the meantime, you've got cannons going off. More smoke. So that in the middle of all of this, that's absolutely right. Bolts is absolutely right. Within a matter of 2 or 3 shots, you literally are seeing nothing. That, by the way, is why you have to be so close. It's not like you're standing 3 and 4 and 500 yards away and shooting. You got to be within literally sight distance to be able, because the only sight you got's over the front of the rifle barrel, that little tiny piece of metal that sticks up. That's it. But once the smoke starts coming up, it's not like you're going to see much anyway. Which begs a question. How do you know which side is winning? Are you ready for this part now? This also blows the minds of my students.
Eventually.
The way you know is the flag. Now hear what I'm saying. The way you know is the flag. The flag is held way up high, above the smoke. The guy holding the flag does not shoot. He holds the flag. That's his job. He is the standard bearer. He holds the pole of the flag. The way you know if the other side is losing is you cannot see their flag. So the first guy to get shot at is who? The guy holding the flag. So if Drake's the one holding the flag, everybody turns their gun first and foremost to the guy holding the flag. He's the first guy to get bunged. Because if the flag goes down, that's proof the other side's losing. So as soon as the flag goes down, somebody, are you ready for this? Somebody has to literally let go of his gun, pick up the flag, and hold it up again. Suicide. Right? So it takes a certain kind of insane courage to drop your firearm and to pick up the flag. Do you got me? Over.
This guy in the front, why?
Over and over and over again. When the flag finally has, are you ready for this? Now see, some of you are going to say, dude, when we were kids on the playground, we played capture the flag and never understood the really dark background to that game. Capturing the flag was the battles of the American Civil War. If you finally shot enough guys, they would either all be dead or they would turn around and run off. The flag would lay on the floor and it meant your side won. Which is why in the beginning of the national anthem that you sing, the words go, how? Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed? Where is the flag? If the flag is still on the flagpole, we're still in the fight. If the flag is gone, the battle is over. And in fact, one of the ways, if you wanted to surrender, was to wave. See, you've seen this maybe in comics and stuff. You just didn't understand what it meant. Wave a white flag. The reason you waved a white flag is because the flag that stood for your side was down. It was gone. Or it had been captured. In a contest, when the two groups finally come together, and by the way, you carry all of your little bullets with you in a little pouch. They're heavy, so you can't carry 200 or 300 of them. You only have a few of these little bullets. So you'll only shoot as many of these as you got bullets. Once you run out of bullets, the only thing left for you to do is to fight with your hands or with your bayonet on the end of your gun. Or you can use your gun as a bat, and they would do that a lot, where they would just swing their gun around. Because once the bullets are all gone, you got nothing else to do. Does that make sense? So when the two groups would come together in hand-to-hand combat, always the guy holding the flag was the one they'd go after. Because if you could capture that flag, then you were the winner of the war. See how that works? I mean, the little battle or whatever. So the flag has everything to do with knowing whether you are surviving or not surviving, especially because you can't see anything. Now, are you ready for this? In battles like Gettysburg, lots of the fighting was done down in declivities. What do you know about smoke when it gets down in a little hollow? The smoke just stays there. So you literally had guys in total smoke just fighting. We have lots and lots of stories from the American Civil War of people killing each other from the same side. Even worse, we have stories of fathers killing sons, brothers killing brothers. These stories come out of the American Civil War all the time, where a father is choking someone to death, and when the smoke finally clears, he's actually killed his own boy. He didn't know who it was. You're in the middle of the fight. Crane, writing after the American Civil War, tries to give readers some sense of what that's like, of what it's like to be in the middle of the complete and total mayhem. We know that in Gettysburg there were several moments when the bodies had fallen and were stacked so high they literally had to crawl over them to be able to continue to fight. These battles of the American Civil War were horrific, horrific battles, right? Of course, there's always the extra question, after the battles ended, and all those bodies are laying there, what do you do with all those decomposing bodies? They smelled before they died. That's the whole point of these guys just sitting, waiting, waiting. It's not like they're in a Hilton or a Marriott. It's not like they're getting a shower every night anyway. And then they die. And then the bodies start to decompose. Gettysburg was fought July 3rd. In the middle of July 3rd. In the middle of the terrible heat wave. So bodies start to deteriorate and then the stench is horrific. The point I'm trying to make is that Crane wants to capture as many. So notice, he elicits a lot of the senses. What you can see, what you can taste, what you can touch, right? What you can see is always a part. But notice, a lot of times in the middle of the battles, you can't see very well either, right? All right, let's now move to our annotation work. I'm with you now with a new sheet of paper, and your hymnal is open to 676, all right? 676.
Wait, what did they do with the body?
Say it out loud.
What did they do with the body?
It's a great question. It's a great question. See, you had sometimes all the graves had to be dug by hand, right? I mean, it's not like, remember, we're in the American Civil War, so it's not like you have those large backhoes like we have today, tractors or whatever, that can create huge holes, right? You can't do it. So whoever is going to bury, it's going to be done by hand, right? And a lot of times, men got left on battlefields and their bodies just stayed there and just rotted. There was no one to bury. In other words, you had to get on to the next contest, to the next battle. Sometimes, and you see this in Red Badge of Courage, remember? He stumbles onto a dead man, remember? Who is sitting there in the middle of the woods. Dude, who's going to bury this cat? Well, yeah, it's, a lot of times you just can't even slow down to do it. Sometimes there were men whose job it was to dig the graves and try and bury them right there in battlefields or whatever. All right, guys, we're going now to 676. And again, we're just kind of practicing our annotation work.
678?
Yeah, it's actually 678. I'm sorry, I said 676. That's where it's began. That's where it'll begin. So you want to log in. You want a number. Remember, Mr. Drake, you got your numbers down the side. Excellent. You want to make sure that you got the page number. You want to make sure that you've got the title of the poem. We're going to look at a very interesting little poem. Yesterday we worked with the text, Great Sherbert, a story about a reflection on a father. Today we're going to look at a different kind of poem, and this is a reflection as well about a father, okay? This poem has received a lot of debate about what it means. Now, hello, one more time. I love to remind you, hey, I'm very happy that by the time you finish studying with me in June, you'll know poems like Rita Dove's Grape Sherbet, right? Something tells me one or two of you will remember that poem long after our summer together. So I'm happy about that. But just to remind you, Mr. Bolts, we are here to learn better how to read actively. So as we work through this poem, again, I want to remind you of what our agenda is. We're trying to learn how to read and annotate, all right? Okay, so let's take a look at it. The poem is called My Papa's Waltz, and the author's name is Theodore Roethke. Roethke, the poet. All right? Okay, so here we go. Red pen in hand, following with the tip of the pen, following the work of reading now. Okay, again, if you need a red pen, we've always got some up here at the front of the room or whatever. Do you need a red pen? Okay. There you go. Anybody else? Here we go. My Papa's Waltz. Let's read it together, all right? So you're following along, Mr. Drake, to read with me. My Papa's Waltz. Oh, I'm sorry, Miss Vigil, I'll wait on you. Miss Mallory as well. I'll wait on you, no worries. Reminding you as well, remember, you are obliged, you're allowed, to write in your book because we are recycling these books. So feel free to do that as we write, as we read, all right? The whiskey on your breath could make a small boy dizzy. But I hung on like death, such waltzing was not easy. We romped until the pans slid from the kitchen shelf. My mother's countenance could not unfrown itself. The hand that held my wrist was battered on one knuckle. At every step you missed, my right ear scraped a buckle. You beat time on my head with a palm caked hard by dirt, then waltzed me off to bed, still clinging to your shirt. Now this is an interesting poem for a number of reasons, not least of which the answer to the question, dude, what's really going on in this poem? I want to first of all point out for your notes though, the only way you're going to understand this poem is to appreciate the word waltz. Let's write that word down and let's get a definition. What is a waltz? Write down your definition. What is a waltz? Does anybody know? What is it? It's a special kind of dance. Yes, a very special kind of dance where you have to actually be trained to do it. And then when you show up to this kind of waltzing, for those of you that watch that show on ABC called Dancing with the Stars, much of their dancing is what we would call waltzing. In other words, it takes practice. Every footstep, every arm placement is prescribed. You learn how to do it, and then you dress up in really nice clothing, a bow tie if you're a guy, a beautiful gown if you're a gal, and you go to this special place where music is usually played live, and you do this thing called waltzing. Now, Rothke is going to play a game that's ironic with the word waltzing, because obviously we ain't got no kind of fancy dancing happening in this poem, right? Let's now take a look at the poem as to be, right? And again, here very quickly, I'll stop saying 2A, 2B, 3A, 3, and so on forth. You'll already know. But if I'm talking about the form of the poem, I'm talking 2B. How many stanzas, Mr. Drake, in this poem? How many stanzas?
4.
We got 4. How many lines in each stanza, Mr. Drollinger? How many lines in each stanza? We got 4 4-line stanzas. So notice, Rothke is playing an interesting game, all right, with us. Notice as well, the last word of the first line, breath. The last word of the third line, death. Do you see it? Notice, Mr. Wenlock, see, I'm pointing out some things about the structure of the poem, right? Notice the last word of the second line, dizzy. The last word of the fourth line, easy. Notice we've got a very interesting kind of rhyme scheme happening. Let's see if we can hear, remember Psalm of Life, tell me not in mournful numbers, life is but an empty dream. Remember that kind of rhythm thing? Let's see if we can see any kind of rhythm here that Rothke's playing with. The whiskey on your breath could make a small boy dizzy, but I hung on like death. Such waltzing was not easy. Notice that only the third line of that first stanza breaks, and it's not the natural rhythm of the poem. Once we take a look at what's going on in the stanza, we'll understand maybe that Rothke's playing a game with us of rhythm as well. I don't have as much time as I would like to do the real full treatment of this poem as I would like, but let's look at it for a few moments, shall we, before we go to break? We're going to ask a couple of questions. In this poem, you got basically 3 people. Right? Right down at level 1. You got 3 people in this poem. The first is who? Who do you want to say first? Well, yeah, that's where we start with. A father. Right? The second is who? The kid, right? The kid. And who's the third? Now that's interesting. It's the mother. Right? So about all 3 of these people, we want to say 1 or 2 things at level 1. What's going on? First of all, about the father. First line. The whiskey on your breath. Now, I've had students that don't understand what that means. What does that mean, the whiskey on your breath? What does that mean? See, some of us grew up around people who drank alcohol of some kind, and so when they spoke to us as children, we knew what that meant. The whiskey on your breath means what? Daddy is what? Daddy's been drinking, or maybe even drunk, right? Daddy's been drinking, so much so that the whiskey stays on the breath, which means probably more than just one shot of whiskey, right? Okay? The guy's been drinking a bit. Notice, the whiskey on your breath could make a small boy dizzy, right? In other words, he's drunk enough that when he speaks to the kid kind of goes, whoa, whoa, right? Almost jacks with the kid. I hung on, interesting simile, like death. Such waltzing was not easy. What do you mean he hung on like death? See, it doesn't make any sense in the first stanza until you get to the second stanza to find out, dude, what is going on in regards to this poem? Look, we romped until the pans slid from the kitchen shelf. What does the word romp mean? Does anyone know that word? You romp about the house. If Mom says, don't romp through the house, what does that mean? Yeah, like a pack of elephants, right? So we romped until the pans slid from the kitchen shelf. Wait a minute, what's going on here? You got a father who's doing what with his boy? He's dancing with his boy where? In the kitchen. And he's swinging him around and dancing with him. Okay? So that's what's going on between the father and the son. Notice the mama. My mother's countenance. What's a countenance? I think your sidebar helps you. Mother's face, right? My mother's countenance could not unfrown itself. What does that mean? Mr. Volz just did a kind of like a frown. Read it like that. If the poet says, my mother's frown, Miss Renault points it out. Mama is not pleased with this display. Right? My mama's countenance could not have frowned. So Mr. Drake, you got a daddy holding on to his boy. Daddy's been drinking a little bit too much whiskey. Holding on to his boy, swinging him around the kitchen, swinging him, romping so hard, pans start sliding off of shelves and stuff. Mama standing in the corner with a frown on her face that ain't going away. Miss Renault says, Mama ain't too pleased about what's going on with this waltz in the kitchen. The hand, third stanza. The hand that held my wrist, when you're dancing, right, was battered on one knuckle. What does that mean, battered on one knuckle? One of the knuckles was what? Yeah, scraped, bloody, right? Which maybe tells us something about the old man as well. Not only is he a drinker, but what? He might be a fighter as well. He might have done, or he dinged it or whatever, right? At every step you missed, my right ear scraped a buckle. Now this one's always hard for students. I don't understand that. Look at it again. What do you think, Vigil, that's about?
When they're dancing, she's standing on, or he or she, whatever, is standing on his feet.
Right. So that's what children do, right? So they stand on the feet of the father, and the father's dancing, right, back and forth. But every time the foot slides off of the kid, the ear, which is right about the height the child's head would be, scrapes on the buckle of the belt. Right? Kind of comfortable or uncomfortable for the kid? Uncomfortable, obviously. You beat time on my head. What's that mean? Right, keeping time, right? With the kid banging on the top of the kid's head. Right, while he's dancing with the kid. You beat time on my head with a palm caked hard by dirt. What? A palm caked hard by dirt. Calluses. Tells us what about the dad? What kind of job does he have? He works with his hands most likely, doesn't he, right? He's a hard man. He's a working man, right? Banging on the boy's head, right? Then waltzed me off to bed, still clinging to your shirt. Last two lines of the poem says that the dad swings the boy into the air, and the only way that the boy can hold on is what? Clinging to what? Grabbing hold of daddy's shirt as the dad swings him off the bed. Now, to A, messages, themes. This poem is a very, very interesting poem. Here's why. There are two readings of this poem. Right, Ms. Williams? There are two ways to read this poem. One sees this poem as a great little picture of a domestic family. A daddy and his boy. How do we know it's a boy? Second line of the poem, right? Drove the little boy dizzy with the smell of the whiskey on his breath. This is a poem about a dad who's tough, who's hard, who's rough, and yet loves his boy and knows how to enjoy his boy. This is a poem about a daddy having a good time with his boy, roughhousing in the kitchen, and mama doesn't like it because mama's the one who clearly is probably going to be the one stuck cleaning all this mess up when he waltzes his boy off to bed. The daddy is the one who puts his boy to bed. In other words, this is a father-son poem, right? And notice from the perspective of the voice of the poet, the speaker, who was once a boy, now has become a man, and he's writing about a memory that he had. When the old man used to come home, a little bit of too much whiskey on his breath, he'd go, "Come here, boy, let's have a little dance." And he'd dance him around the kitchen, banging him on top of the head. The boy's face maybe getting scraped by the belt buckle, but he clings to the shirt. And this is one of those kind of poems where you go, yeah, I can totally see this. A dad playing with his boy right before he has to take the boy off to bed. Probably mama's the one that's saying he needs to get to bed, and the boy's probably saying, "No, I don't want to go to bed. I want to stay and dance with daddy," that kind of thing. That's one view of this poem. But there is a second view of this poem. And it is the reading of the poem that says, why would this be in a high school anthology? This is a little difficult for me to read. What's a second possible reading of this poem? Write it down at 2A. And what are going to be the indicators when we start to read close? Do you understand my question here, Mr. Drake? When we start to read close, there seems to be some stuff maybe going on here that ain't being said, but it is being implied. Something else is going on here. This ain't a happy poem about a happy family. There's something else going on here. And there's all kinds of giveaways that say, this is a poem about an abusive father, Miss Renaud says. This is a poem about abuse. It isn't a poem about a celebration at all. This is a poem about a dad who comes home, too much whiskey, drinking too much, and he slings his boy around the kitchen. There's all kinds of interesting reasons to take a look at this poem from the second perspective. Now, some of you will say, I don't even want to hear this perspective. I like this poem the way it is. It's kind of a fun poem about a daddy who's having a good time with his boy, and I can kind of see the mama standing there with her arms crossed, frowning, saying, seriously? Who's going to clean this up? Go ahead, Miss Renaud.
That's the way the child looks at it and said it's a fun time.
This is a fascinating view from Miss Renaud. Brilliant observation. Children have a certain view. Just like we said yesterday, oh, hurrah, we get to go to a new kind of park. No, this is not a park. This is a cemetery. Cemetery? What's a cemetery? See, children don't get it. And so for the boy, there's a certain perspective that, hey, this is a good time. But maybe a more mature reader of this poem goes, whoa, 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 there's something else going on here. Take a look real quickly. We're told, first of all, he is a drinker. Notice the third line. What an interesting simile. I hung on like death. And notice, Mr. McAfee, that it's fascinating. The verb hung on of the third line plays with the last line's 16, clinging. Holding on, clinging, right? Like, oh no, oh no, oh no, oh no, right? Notice the word romp can have double meanings. It can have playful, but romp can also be a violent kind of verb, right? Romp. Keep reading. Notice the mother is not pleased. If this was a happy domestic picture, aww, a dad having good times with his little boy, mama would probably have a different view, right? Even if she does have to clean up the mess. Here, Mama's not pleased, and that's fairly evident from this. She's not happy with what's going on. But notice, she's an outsider in all of this. With the exception of this one reference, Mama does not exist in this poem. She is the outsider. She's the one standing off to the side, watching this unfold. Notice, she cannot interfere. Third stanza. We're told that he batters, right? His knuckle is battered while he beats the head of the boy. Both of those words begin with the letter B, and both of those words are violent words. Agreed? Those aren't fun words. Those are unfun words, right? Notice, finally, he waltzes him off to bed, clinging to the shirt, which begs the question, is the boy really having a good time, or is the boy rather afraid? This is the fear of a child. I hope I don't get hurt. Now, what's fascinating about this poem, and again, I apologize, we don't have more time for it, but at 3B, we could ask a really intriguing question. How do you read this poem? We've given you two options. How do you read it? Do you read it as an example of a fun domestic scene? Or do you read it rather as a poem of violent abuse? This little boy is in a situation no little boy should ever be in. But that sometimes parents treat their children in ways that are not real healthy. And children don't understand often until the end. Obviously, some of the way you read this poem, can I say this out loud? Some of the way you read this poem has to do with your own biography, doesn't it? Within your family and around other families. I once had a student that said, I read this poem different and not as hopeful because I grew up with a pal of mine and he would sneak out of his house and come and stay at my house for the night because of the insanity that was going on in his house. And when he told me about it, it sounded a lot like this. When Daddy got too drunk, he did stuff he thought was funny. He was laughing, but nobody else was laughing. But he was a strong man, and he was the head of the house, and nobody messed with Dad. So I can't read this as a happy moment. Other students will say, this happened all the time. My dad, he had a drink or two, and when he got a little buzzed, he would come home and he would swing me around and that kind of thing. And it was all just fun and games. So it a lot depends on maybe the reader's own background. Let's just point out in closing, Rothke has created a pretty remarkable piece if it can be read on two different levels simultaneously, huh? Isn't that quite remarkable?
I read this multiple times and I didn't see that second one.
Yeah, Mr. Bolt's saying, see, and I appreciate what Mr. Bolt's just said. I'd looked at this poem before. Thank you, Mr. Bolt's, for not saying to me out loud, really? Why do I got to read a poem I already read before? Mr. Bolt's, by the way, has now given us the answer. You can read this poem when you're very young, and sometimes you just don't see it or you don't get it. In other words, as Miss Renaud pointed out, you're like the kid in the poem. You really do not understand what's going on. And then you read it when you get a little older and you go, there's clearly a game being played here by a great poet like Rothke. Thank you. We will come back here in a bit for some writing work.